All right, tonight we continue on with our study. You know, this has been a long time since we started actually 1 Samuel, and that took us, I think, well over half a year. I won't say a full year, but got close to it, and now into 2 Samuel. And this is number 15, and we are in chapter 15. There are 37 verses in this one. I simply entitled this one's Absalom's Conspiracy. There's a whole lot more to it than just that. But we're going to be looking at, and I tell you, the more you get into this, there's more than I can possibly cover in this. In fact, when you read other commentators and how far they will go, or for instance, you look at A.W. Pink's book on the life of David. I think he's got 4 or 5 chapters just in this chapter alone that he deals with on it. I'm going to introduce to you some of the characters, the primary characters that we began looking at a little bit here, just to kind of give you a little bit more. Of course, it's going to be in this area, David and Absalom, but there's also going to be Ahithophel, Ahimaaz, can't even say it, Zadok, Jonathan, Abiathar, and Hushai. These are all particular individuals that come to play. They're not the only ones in this chapter, but they are certainly the ones listed. Ittai is listed only as one of David's mighty men. You'll find him further on in chapter 23. Ahithophel is, or really, by the time you get done with this chapter, he was one of David's most trusted advisors and a very wise counselor, advisor. In fact, it is said that whenever he spoke, whenever he counseled, it's as if he spoke the oracle of God. So whoever he was counseling, he got good advice. At one time it was David, and then of course he's going to slip over and turn to Absalom. Ahimaaz was a priest who remained loyal to David during the rebellion. Zadok, as his father, is also a loyal priest. Jonathan was the son of the high priest, was also loyal to David. Abiathar was a very long-time associate of David's. He was David's priest, if you remember, during the exile, and eventually will be made and has been made high priest by David. He later, though, becomes a very controversial figure. And Hushai is the last on the board that's up there. He's called the Archite, basically noting his geographical location. And very little is known about him other than he appears to be a very close friend and advisor to David. And very likely, too, he's an older man, and we'll see some of that. David has had some men that have really stood and fought with him from the time, if you remember, he started out with about 200 men when he was exiled, and then it grew up to about 600 men. And they were very much in favor with David, and David found them to be very profitable to him and great friends of his as well. When we look at just this first section, just verses 1 through 6, I'm not going to spend any time noting all of the other things, but this because it has to do with Absalom, and I'm going to give you a couple of, well, actually 3 different labels, verse 1, verse 2, and then verse 3 through 6, where you just see him just trying, and the best way I could say it, it's a focused, flamboyant flaunting. I mean, that's what he does. You'll see it in the very first verse. Then we'll see a very devious, determined digging. That's how he treats people when they come into the city. And then lastly, a corruptly crafted concern. So we're going to look first of all at what I said, a focused, flamboyant flaunting. Verse 1, and it came to pass after this. Remember, we're not going to go back and try and review chapter 14, but that's what it's talking about. That Absalom prepared him chariots and horses and 50 men to run before him. Now, it might be well to remind you at this point that the kings of Israel were not supposed to collect horses. That was a no-no. Most of them, if they had anything, they had mules. That's the combination between a burro, a donkey, and a horse. Mules don't interbreed, so they can't do that, but they would keep horses for some amount. But Absalom is trying to stand out. That's why I called it a flamboyant or a focused flamboyant flaunting. He's trying to, the whole thing is designed to attract attention. It's also designed to show his importance, or that he's got some sort of authority and power. One of the most, parts of this is just simply, this is Absalom's conspiracy from the very beginning all the way through. Every step that you see Absalom take is a part of working out his conspiracy to gain the throne and really to even remove. He's not going to wait around for David to die. He's not going to wait around for David to appoint him the king. He's seeking to oust his own father immediately. That's where then, too, we go to verse 2, where I called it that devious, determined digging. It says, Absalom rose up early and stood beside the way of the gate. And it was so, this is why I call it the digging, that when any man that had a controversy came to the king for judgment, then Absalom called unto him and said, excuse me, of what city art thou? And he said, thy servant is one of the tribes of Israel. He's digging, he's trying to ask some questions, but there's a purpose to it. He's trying again to feign interest. And watch the way that he talks on the rest of this too, where it says, and Absalom said unto him, see, thy matters are good and right. I know whatever you're looking for, why, you're the guy. You're going to be right. But there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. In other words, no man is deputized. No man has the authority. Say, king's busy. He can't come down here and hear you. So he's feigning an interest in the person before the situation is even known. He's actually literally trying to make them feel important, and by himself appearing to be important. And that's what a lot of people do. They want to try and make themselves appear important and then approach with this kind of flattery so that he makes them feel even more important. It is really a very corruptly crafted concern. And Absalom said unto him, see, thy matters are good and right, but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee. Absalom said, moreover, oh, that I were made judge in the land. You notice, again, David just really isn't taking care of business. He isn't staying on top of things. And if I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, I would do him justice. Well, he again shows himself to be on the side of that individual without even knowing what the situation was, and without any real power to settle the matter. So he complains that David hasn't given him this authority. Verse 4 again, I should have this, that you would come and I'd take care of all this business. So he's presented himself as the answer to every man's quest for timely, fair, and compassionate justice. I mean, that's the big thing. It makes it appear. And remember again, people are susceptible to flattery. Especially when you see a guy riding around the city. He's got 50 men in front of him, got chariots and horses. Man, it just looks like this guy is the opulent king. He's the king's son. Oh, that I might be the judge. Yeah. Well, he's got a whole purpose here. Verse 5, and it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do him obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. In other words, he stopped him. Before that man could show him honor, he showed that man honor. But again, it's a crafted concern. He's not that interested. In verse 6, and on this manner did Absalom to all Israel that came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Now, if he was honest when he was doing this, it wouldn't have talked about him stealing their hearts. He would just gain their hearts. But his goal was successful. He reaped their respect. He acquired their allegiance. He transferred their royal respect for David to himself, and that was his whole goal. What we see from there then is a patient, powerful plot. And it came to pass after 40 years. Now, a lot of people, again, always like to find some sort of contradiction in the Bible. So they will say, well, this would put, if that was true and it was 40 years that Absalom did all this, it would be at the end of David's reign. Well, he doesn't tell you after 40 years of what, but after 40 years of from David being anointed king, we don't know. But what it does show you is this, that Absalom was very patient in plotting out his purpose. So it came to pass after 40 years that Absalom said unto the king, so now he's going to act it out, I pray thee, let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed unto the Lord in Hebron. I don't think so. That's not what he was doing. It took him a long time, there's no question about it, to steal the hearts of the men of Israel. He was very patient and very persistent, and he had a powerful appeal. But now it's time to execute the scheme. For thy servant vowed a vow while I abode at Geshur in Syria, saying, if the Lord shall bring me again indeed to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord. Do you think he said that? I think he's lying. I don't think he said that at all. This whole thing is a concoction again. Verse 9, and the king said unto him, go in peace. So he arose and went to Hebron. Now that he has the blessings of the king, his moves will not be suspicious. I don't know if David became suspicious while he was in the gate or not. I would think that he did. But I have some other opinions that I'll share with you as we go through this chapter. But the king told him to go. There's the aim. So when he does, he rose up, he goes down there, and he sets in motion the plans with the allegiances that he has formed. Verse 10, but Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel. Where do you get these? From making all those allegiances, sitting in the gate, concocting these plans. I think as he gained their ear, he would also gain the ideas of, David's he's the old school. We need to get past him, and he's really not doing anything anymore. Who knows what all he said, but he had spies, and he sent them throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, as soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then ye shall say, Absalom reigneth in Hebron. Now, what we learn next too in verse 11 is that he's got about 200 men with him. And with Absalom went 200 men out of Jerusalem that were called, and they went in their simplicity, and they knew not anything. Well, what does that mean? It's simply that they were being honorable men who were serving the king's son. They went in their simplicity. They didn't know anything about Absalom's plot or plan to try and depose David from off of his throne. They only knew that they were to obey his command, and that's what they were doing. But their very presence with Absalom gave Absalom some credibility. People saw him not only as he have these men, 50 men, and the chariots and the horses, much more opulent. It's like they're moving up in the world, but now too, he's got another 200 men beside that. So and Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city, even from Gilo, while he offered sacrifices. And the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. Now, this is again one of those men that Absalom stole the heart, and that heart belonged to Ahithophel. That man was one of David's closest allies and advisors. And if you look ahead, you want to put down again 2 Samuel 16:23. Again, you'll see that's where it says that his word was like the oracle of God. It's interesting to note his relationship to Bathsheba and to Uriah the Hittite. So there's a relationship there, and it's very likely where, again, he's interested in getting back at David, and that's why this happens. This conspiracy, this treasonous alliance was strong, and it's noted there because it talks about the people increased continually with Absalom. But there's a little bit more in that, and that there were no defections either. You know, anytime you have somebody that's trying to conspiracy, some people usually see through it after a while and fall away. His conspiracy was so strong and so structured that it grew, and nobody ever left Absalom. They stuck with him. The plot had been carried out, and control is gained. Verse 13, and there came a messenger to David, saying, the hearts of the men of Israel are after Absalom. And that doesn't mean after in a bad way. That means they are set to Absalom. David knows this. This news breaks his heart. And what does he do? It's quite interesting that you would think, whether it was his son or not, but you remember before we learned that David's heart was towards Absalom. He had banned him off to his own city, to his own home. He was not allowed to come to any family functions, no government functions. And the moment Absalom does is he's allowed to come back, he starts plotting, planning, and begins to depose David from off of this. Verse 14. This is David's depressing departure. And David said unto all his servants that were with him, in fact, this section goes to the end of the chapter, arise and let us flee. Interesting. No fight, no sword. Nobody's going to stand up. And David, I think there's something to this where he says, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring evil upon us and smite the city with the edge of the sword. He knew what Absalom's intentions were, and he knew how cold and callous Absalom was. In fact, I will tell you, I think David looks more to the protection of his own family and his servants than he will for his own personal protection. But he didn't just take off. That's one thing that tells you David wasn't just running off to get away and flee for himself and his own life. David was making sure that his family, his servants, his friends were going to be taken care of. And there's something else. It doesn't say it in here, but it just seems to me that David has a lot of guilt and shame. Remember his sin with Bathsheba, his murder of Uriah the Hittite. Remember that there are a lot of people in his palace and in his group that are around him that know exactly what David did. They also know what Nathan did in coming to rebuke David. Remember, that was that last chapter, and Nathan told him that story, and then he told him, thou art the man. You know, you're the man that stole when you've got all these women, and you went and stole that one man's one wife. You know, what a shame. Now he says, too, because you did this all in secret, God's not going to do it in secret to you. God's going to make it obvious. It's going to be open. It's going to be that everybody's going to know it. And he also tells them, to remember, he says, one's going to rise from your own family. I think David, because of that comment of Nathan, and because he knows that God is chastening him, sees everything that happens here as a chastening from the Lord. It doesn't approve it. It doesn't mean that it's okay. It doesn't mean that Absalom is right. It just means that he knows this is what God is allowing him to do. So in that too, verse 15 and 16, let me read. And the king's servant said unto the king, Behold, thy servants are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king shall appoint. You tell us, David, and that's what we'll do. Verse 16, And the king went forth, and all his household after him, and the king left 10 women, which were concubines, to keep the house. Now that might sound like a good idea, but it's actually going to be devastating to him and to the women that he leaves behind. Whatever his reasons may have been, that decision is going to cost really a time of terrible shame upon his own home. Verse 17, And the king went forth, and all the people after him, and tarried in a place that was afar off. And all his servants passed on beside him. And all the Cherethites, and all the Pelethites, and all the Gittites, 600 men which came after him from Gath, passed on before the king. Isn't it interesting that Absalom was able to steal all the hearts of the men of Israel? But it's men who are not Israelis who stay there with David and stay loyal to him. His own nation has abandoned him. But these men who stick, they're not going to flee. They stuck by David, and they will stick with him through thick and thin. Now we'll also now find in verse 9 one of the major names we mentioned at the first, Ittai, and it's best known because of being listed as one of David's mighty men. David speaks to him as the leader of this band of probably the 600 men. Verse 19, Then said the king to Ittai the Gittite, Wherefore goest thou also with us? Return to thy place and abide with the king, for thou art a stranger and also an exile. Now, I don't know if he was an older man as well, but he'd been with David for a long time, and possibly too, again, this may go back clear to where David went into the Philistines into Gath, and he wants to release them from any of the coming hardships or danger that may approach them. So here's what he says to him, And whereas thou camest but yesterday, in other words, you've been out fighting and doing these other things, and now you've just come in the other day, and should I this day make thee go up and down with us? Seeing I go whither I may, return now and take back thy brethren, mercy and truth be with thee. So again, that's why I said David seems to be very concerned with other people's situation. He says, you just got done traveling, you've just got done fighting, you've been out there fighting for the kingdom, and here you are traveling. No, you go back home. So whatever the tough trip was, David doesn't want him to experience any more than what he had already experienced. Verse 21, And Ittai answered the king and said, As the Lord liveth, and as my lord the king liveth, surely in what place my lord the king shall be, whether in death or life, even there will also thy servant be. Here's a guy who said, Nope, doesn't matter, David. I'm not worried about what's going to happen. Life or death, I'm going to be right there next to you. He shows real allegiance. Verse 22, And David said to Ittai, Go and pass over. And Ittai the Gittite passed over, and all his men and all the little ones that were with him. And all the country wept with a loud voice. Now, again, when you see that, all the country, we're talking about those that were present, those that were around, not the entire nation, because you got to remember already it says that the men had their hearts stolen by Absalom. So it can't include everybody. So we always got to remember when you read the word all, put it in its context, make sure you understand what it's saying. So anyway, he told him they passed over. The king himself also passed over the brook Kidron, and all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness. All of those who were in this area had a mind of love and concern for David. It's also very interesting. Here's where you can get off when you start looking at the brook Kidron. And if you compare that, as Pink does, with Christ and his passing over the brook Kidron to go to Calvary. Actually, to go, I believe it's over to the Gethsemane, where he prayed all night long. But it's got a good story background when you start looking at the comparison between David passing this way and Christ, because David is a type of Christ. Next we find Zadok, Abiathar, the priest, and the ark of the covenant of God passing out of the city in verse 24. And lo, Zadok also, and all the Levites were with him, bearing the ark of the covenant of God. And they set down the ark of God, and Abiathar went up until all the people had done passing out of the city. And the king said unto Zadok, carry back the ark of God into the city. If I shall find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me again and show me both it and his habitation. In other words, he didn't want that ark to be in the middle of the fight. He didn't want that ark to be destroyed. He was protecting it again, as much as I talked to you about earlier, protecting some of these other people. So it seems to me David was very selfless in his concern for others or for the honor of the ark, and rather than see his ease or even an ability, you would think you want to keep the ark because that was prestigious to have the ark of the covenant of the Lord right there. Are you going to fight against that? But David didn't look at it that way. Everything he did was selfless in this point, by and large, and everything Absalom did was selfish. He sought its safety and return to Jerusalem. But if he thus say, I have no delight in thee, talking about the Lord, behold, here I am, let him do as seemeth good unto him. So David again seems to be ready to acquiesce to whatever it is that the Lord brings his way. This is why, again, I think a lot of this is David sees this as God's chastening hand upon him. He's carrying the guilt. He's carrying the shame. There's no doubt about that. And I believe that, again, he just feels like this is what he must endure because of what he has done in his life. And verse 27, then the king said also unto Zadok the priest, art thou not a seer? Well, yes, of course. Then here's the deal. I want you to return into the city in peace, and your two sons with you, Ahimaaz, thy son, and Jonathan, the son of Abiathar. Why does he want them to return? Well, he's not just wanting them to return. He's got a little plan of his own. Verse 28, see, I will tarry in the plain of wilderness until there come word from you to certify me. In other words, he's sending him back, but he's got a motive in leaving this priestly family in Jerusalem. He wanted them to stay behind and to find out the actual numerical strength and power of the conspiracy. He needed eyes and ears to send, and loyal hearts to send him information about what was really going on inside the palace and inside Hebron. Zadok, therefore, and Abiathar carried the ark of God again to Jerusalem, and they tarried there. This journey and the next are noticed really as to how they went. And David went up by the ascent of Mount Olivet and wept as he went up and had his head covered. And he went barefoot. And all the people that was with him covered every man his head, and they went up weeping as they went up. David's heart is broken. His actions and his attire seem to demonstrate it. David sees again and senses the hand of God that is heavy upon him. And in fact, you can read, I haven't even touched on them, but you can read, for instance, Psalm 3 says that psalm was written as David fled as Absalom was after him. So some of these, in fact, that particular psalm is written in 4 different divisions, 2 verses each that are there. and they speak about what's going on. David's heart is broken. He feels God's hand is upon him. Verse 31, and one told David, here's the real killer, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. That must have broken his heart, but here's what he said. Quick, simple, short prayer. David said, O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Because he knows the kind of counsel and advice that Ahithophel gave. But it is for us a quick, short, to-the-point prayer. Folks, you don't have to all the time lay out and pray for 15, 20 minutes. Just get to the point. Exactly what you need. And that's what David did. Verse 32, the last section from here to the end is about Hushai. And it came to pass that when David was come to the top of the mount where he worshiped God, behold, Hushai the Archite came to meet him with his coat rent and earth upon his head. Already we see a man that's in sync with David. But you also notice something else. David mourned. Remember? He was mourning. He had the dirt upon his head, no feet or no shoes on his feet. He was mournful, sorrowful. But what else do you see when it came to pass that when David was come to the top of the mount where he what? Worshipped God. Oh, you know what? My heart was just broken, Pastor Una. I couldn't be at church because I was so depressed. That's the best time to be here. David did not fail to worship, though he was worrying and concerned and wearied. Again, go back and read Psalm 3. You'll see the divisions of it because you'll see Selah after 2 verses. Read 2 more, Selah. Every one of those have to do, and I think that it was written probably along the way. But again, Hushai is another one of David's trusted companions from probably earlier days. Hushai mourned with David and for David, and he was certainly an older man who had earned the great respect of David. And we find David making the best use of this situation and giving counsel to an old friend of how he could best help David. So what happens? Verse 33, and unto David said, If thou passest on with me, then thou shalt be a burden unto me. But if thou return to the city, well, isn't that kind of strange? If you go with me, you're going to be a burden to me. Why would he be a burden? Because he's older. David had to care for him. David would care for him. David would make sure that he was well taken care of. But he said, if you return to the city, you go to say to Absalom, I will be thy servant, O king, as I have been thy father's servant hitherto. So will I now also be thy servant, and then mayest thou for me, defeat the counsel of Ahithophel. And hast thou not there with thee Zadok and Abiathar the priests? Therefore it shall be that what things soever thou shalt hear out of the king's house, thou shalt tell it to Zadok and Abiathar the priest. Behold, they have there with them their 2 sons, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son, and by them ye shall send unto me everything that ye can hear. He's got a plot. He's got a plan too. He knows that he can trust these men explicitly. And the last verse that we read, so Hushai, David's friend. That's the part that ought to make sense to us more than anything else. Here was a man who was David's friend, and he did exactly as he asked him to. He went back into the city, and Absalom came into Jerusalem. It's an important part, really, of David's survival. Though we notice that David really left everything in the hands of God, he didn't do nothing. Now, I will tell you, some commentators will tell you that this David failed to trust the Lord. He should have just left it in the hands of the Lord. Well, he did leave it in the hands of the Lord. He left every one of those men. You go back and do this. But he knew that Absalom could have found him out. He could have killed him, could have done any number of things. Some people, and I will tell you, even again, Pink is one of those that he kind of puts the mark on him, like this was Abraham and Sarah, who sought the help of the arm of the Lord by giving Abraham one of his maidens there to have a child with. God doesn't need your help. God doesn't need our help. But David, though he would not raise arms against Absalom, he would not remain defenseless. He would make sure that he was doing something to keep informed about what was taking place. With that, we're done with chapter 15, and we'll get back into 16 again. Excuse me, every bit of this builds up, and you can just begin to see the drama in each chapter. But it all does come from that one time, really, when David, I think, should have been out where kings were and fighting, and instead was loafing around in the house, got up on top of the roof line, and saw Bathsheba, and let his flesh lust after her, and he would not control it. And that not only, it didn't destroy his kingdom like it did for Saul, but it certainly destroyed his family, and his family became dysfunctional. If you notice, Absalom, this is his father. There's no kindness, there's no comfort, there's nothing. Now, David has a great love for Absalom, but it may have been, too, that he loved Absalom so much that he never disciplined him.